We don't need men with guns arriving with promises and leaving with our gold. One sentence. But it sent shockwaves through the Pentagon, lit a firestorm on African social media, and forced the hand of Western powers used to quiet compliance. It wasn't said by a global superpower, nor by a seasoned diplomat. It came from a young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, and it turned a routine diplomatic meeting into a geopolitical earthquake. That night, under dim amber lights in the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat face-to-face with the U.S. ambassador. No smiles, no small talk, just raw tension. On the table, two dossiers. One, a proposal from the U.S. wrapped in threat accept AFRICOM or lose aid investment and international backing. The other, Traoré's trump card, a confidential file exposing something far deeper. Inside were satellite images, not of terror camps, but of untapped mineral fields. Contracts not debated in Parliament, but signed in secrecy. Names not foreign, but familiar, linked to both local traders and foreign power brokers. Among them, a U.S.-based firm with direct ties to the president's inner circle in Washington. This was no defense pact. It was extraction in disguise, and Traoré called it out. Within hours, a leaked video began to spread. Hashtags like No to AFRICOM and African Defense by Africans exploded across West African platforms. From military generals to street vendors, from students to elders, the people rose. From Washington to Brussels, alarms rang. Burkina Faso, long viewed as a pawn on the geopolitical chessboard, had flipped the board, and Traoré. He wasn't just rejecting a military base. He was rejecting a century-old system of quiet domination hidden behind handshakes and hollow promises. For the first time in a long time, Africa was not reacting, it was declaring. The air inside the presidential meeting room could be sliced with a knife. It was past 10 p.m. in Ouagadougou, but the tension had reached its peak. Ibrahim Traoré, young and uncompromising, sat still with eyes locked onto his guest, the United States ambassador. The American's words came like cold steel wrapped in velvet. If you reject AFRICOM, understand this military aid stops, IMF support evaporates, and every major investment from infrastructure to healthcare will vanish. It was a threat polished in the language of diplomacy, but Traoré had come prepared. He didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly placed a second dossier on the table, one not found in any Western archive. The ambassador glanced at the cover, then back at Traoré. The message was clear: this meeting would not go as planned. Inside the folder were high-resolution satellite images, geological scans of undisclosed gold veins and oil traces in the north. More damning, however, was a preliminary contract signed 3 months prior between a U.S.-linked company named Gold Star Global and a high-ranking Burkinabe general named Ouagadougou. Traoré's voice was calm, yet piercing. Is this base about fighting terrorism or about stealing resources? Because I have your company names, your satellite data, and even records connecting your president's relatives to these operations. For the first time, the ambassador's expression cracked. He masked it quickly, responding coolly. We're here to ensure regional stability. AFRICOM is a strategic opportunity for your country. No, Traoré cut in sharply. It's a mask, and we do not welcome masked men on our soil. At that moment, a soldier stepped in, handing the president a phone. On the screen, a storm, Nyarder no to AFRICOM, was trending across West Africa. The confidential documents had been leaked. This ends now, Traoré said. AFRICOM will not touch Burkinabe soil. My country is not a pawn. Outside, the night trembled. A storm had begun, not of bullets or bombs, but of truth. The air inside the presidential meeting room could be sliced with a knife. It was past 10 p.m. in Ouagadougou, but the tension had reached its peak. Ibrahim Traoré, young and uncompromising, sat still with eyes locked onto his guest, the United States ambassador. The American's words came like cold steel wrapped in velvet. If you reject AFRICOM, understand this. Military aid stops, IMF support evaporates, and every major investment from infrastructure to healthcare will vanish. It was a threat polished in the language of diplomacy, but Traore had come prepared. He didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly placed a second dossier on the table, one not found in any Western archive. The ambassador glanced at the cover, then back at Traore. The message was clear: this meeting would not go as planned. Inside the folder were high-resolution satellite images, geological scans of undisclosed gold veins, and oil traces in the north. More damning, however, was a preliminary contract signed 3 months prior between a U.S.-linked company named Gold Star Global and a high-ranking Burkina general named Ouagadougou. Traore's voice was calm, yet piercing. Is this base about fighting terrorism or about stealing resources? Because I have your company names, your satellite data, and even records connecting your president's relatives to these operations. For the first time, the ambassador's expression cracked. He masked it quickly, responding coolly. We're here to ensure regional stability. AFRICOM is a strategic opportunity for your country. No, Traore cut in sharply. It's a mask, and we do not welcome masked men on our soil. At that moment, a soldier stepped in, handing the president a phone. On the screen, a storm. No to AFRICOM was trending across West Africa. The confidential documents had been leaked. This ends now, Traore said. AFRICOM will not touch Burkina soil. My country is not a pawn. Outside, the night trembled. A storm had begun, not of bullets or bombs, but of truth. When the classified documents hit the internet, it wasn't just Burkina Faso that shook, it was the entire world order that blinked. In Washington, it was 4:17 a.m. Inside the White House Situation Room, the screens flickered with images from Ouagadougou's Revolution Square. Tens of thousands of people waving banners with No to AFRICOM and African defense by Africans. Live on CNN, a red ticker flashed beneath the anchor. Burkina Faso expels AFRICOM, rejects aid, issues warning to global powers. The CIA director exhaled sharply. The Secretary of Defense's face turned crimson. We underestimated this kid, one national security advisor muttered. No, another said. We underestimated an entire continent. In Brussels, NATO convened an emergency session. In Paris, a sharp statement was issued. If Burkina Faso refuses to cooperate with the West, there will be consequences. Meanwhile, Beijing saw opportunity. Moscow issued support. We respect the sovereign decisions of African nations. But Traore wasn't choosing Russia, nor China. He was choosing Burkina Faso, and more importantly, an Africa that leads itself. Back home, the presidency became a fortress. Unknown drones hovered over mining zones. Senior officials began disappearing. Western media ran headlines claiming Traore had fallen under pro-Russian influence. But Traore stood firm. In an emergency security briefing, his advisor, Mariama Diabate, spoke clearly. We are under siege on 4 fronts: economically, through media disinformation, cyber intrusions, and internal sabotage. But we are not cornered yet. Traore nodded silently. That night, for the first time in national history, a continent-wide proposal was aired on Burkina Faso's state television. Standing beneath the flag, facing the camera with unwavering eyes, Traore declared the creation of a new regional alliance, the African Defense Federation ADF, led by Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, and South Africa. His voice echoed across the continent. We're told to choose between America, Russia, or China. We choose ourselves. This was no longer a political decision. It was a declaration and a revolution. Burkina Faso, once overlooked, had become the epicenter of Africa's defiance. Ouagadougou no longer sleeps. Revolution Square, once just a symbolic space, has become the epicenter of a movement. Under the flickering glow of thousands of phones, the people of Burkina Faso, students, teachers, vendors, veterans, raised their fists and shouted in unison, No to AFRICOM, Burkina is not for sale. Africa is awake for the first time in generations. They were not divided by class, ethnicity, or language. They were not a collection of struggling nations. They were one people declaring that Africa would no longer accept being treated as someone else's playing field. Back in Washington, the Pentagon was still in crisis mode. Security meetings went late into the morning. Major international outlets like CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera all reported the same stunning development: Burkina Faso expels AFRICOM. The headlines were bold, the coverage urgent, and across every screen, one name rose above the noise: Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader from a landlocked country now at the center of a continental awakening. But while the world was reacting, Traoré was not celebrating. He wasn't smiling. In the war room of the presidential palace, surrounded by advisors and urgent reports, he was thinking ahead because he knew that this was only the beginning. The next war, he understood, would not be fought with tanks or bullets. It would be fought with disinformation, planted stories, manipulated videos, an information war designed to fracture unity and repaint resistance as instability. It would be fought in the banks, where decisions made by foreign institutions could starve an entire population. And it would be fought from within through bribes, sabotage, and betrayal. But this time, Traoré was not alone. From Mali to Niger, from Guinea to South Africa, others were watching closely. Across Africa, activists were translating his speech into Swahili, Hausa, Zulu, Bambara. A new generation unchained from colonial trauma was discovering a radical truth: Africa does not need to choose between empires. Africa can choose itself. Burkina Faso, once labeled as poor, unstable, and easy to manipulate, had taught the world that power is not in wealth but in will. A nation whose people know who they are and what they stand for cannot be broken no matter how mighty the opponent. And in that clarity, that conviction, something new was born of fire that no foreign power could extinguish. So what comes next? Traoré knew that the battle would continue. But for the first time in a long time, Africa was not reacting. It was declaring. It was writing its own story, not with fear, but with resolve. And now the call must spread. If you believe Africa deserves real sovereignty, share this message. If you believe military bases cannot hide behind humanitarian masks, speak up. If you believe the youth can rewrite history, stand with them. Because we don't need to be saved. We just need to believe in ourselves and in each other. And this is only the beginning. Burkina Faso has stepped out of the shadows, but who will follow? In the next episode, we'll dive into what's unfolding in Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Will they join the African Defense Federation, who is trying to sabotage this from within? Can a true continental alliance be forged by Africans for Africans? Don't miss what's next. Ouagadougou didn't erupt with war, but with voices. Not with violence, but with unity. Not with weapons, but with will. On the streets of the capital, beneath flickering phone screens and the glow of torches, something historic happened. People, not politicians, declared a new era. Students marched next to elders. Teachers linked arms with vendors. Soldiers saluted alongside civilians. The slogans rang through the night air, like thunder echoing off concrete. No to AFRICOM. Burkina is not for sale. Africa is awake. It was more than a protest. It was more than resistance. It was a collective remembering, a return to dignity that had been buried beneath centuries of silence, shame, and subjugation. And while the world's media zoomed in on angry crowds, missed in the noise, was a simple truth. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about a continent that finally realized it never needed permission to stand tall. Halfway across the world, alarms buzzed in Washington, Brussels, Paris. The Pentagon went into lockdown. Intelligence officers scrambled to rewrite assessments. Analysts called it the most severe geopolitical blow to U.S.-Africa relations since the Cold War. In press rooms and briefing halls, one name kept surfacing: Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier turned president, a man under 40, a man who had done what few dared, to even whisper, say no to empire. But Traore wasn't celebrating. Inside the war room at the presidential palace, his eyes weren't on headlines. They were on risk assessments, communication intercepts, encrypted threats. He knew what would come next. The blowback, the smear campaigns, the sabotage, economic, digital, internal. He knew the next war would be quieter. The next war would not start with missiles, it would start with rumors. Rumors of Russian influence, claims that Traore was a puppet, reports of instability, of humanitarian crises, of economic collapse, all seeded by think tanks and independent analysts who never once set foot in Ouagadougou. It would start in bank boardrooms where loans are denied, not for economics but for politics, where institutions like the IMF and World Bank, with friendly smiles and folded hands, hold entire nations hostage through currency pressure and budget blackmail. And worst of all, it would start from within when allies are bought off, when old generals resurface, when foreign operatives begin funding local dissent. But Traore was ready, because this wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger than Burkina Faso. On live television, standing behind the national flag, Traore addressed not just his country, but a continent. "We are not choosing between America, Russia, or China," he said. "We are choosing ourselves." It was not anti-West. It was anti-subjugation. His words were translated overnight into French, Hausa, Swahili, Arabic. From Bamako to Nairobi, from Johannesburg to Accra, young Africans shared his speech like wildfire. They weren't just inspired, they were affirmed. That night, Traore proposed something once thought impossible: the African Defense Federation. A security alliance built by Africans for Africans. No foreign generals, no outside mandates, no hidden contracts. Burkina Faso is not a superpower. It has no nuclear arsenal, no tech giants, no deep-sea ports. Yet in that moment, it did something no amount of money or military could do. It said, "Enough." And the world listened. Because real power doesn't lie in what you own. It lies in what you refuse to surrender. Burkina Faso refused to be mined, masked, manipulated. It refused to be called unstable for wanting independence. It refused to be bribed into silence. And when one country stands up, others begin to question why they're still on their knees. In Mali, protesters echoed the chants. In Guinea, ministers debated joining ADF. In Niger, student groups called for full military sovereignty. In South Africa, radio hosts replayed Traore's speech with tears in their eyes. A shift was happening. One not dictated from Washington, not orchestrated in Beijing, not maneuvered by Paris. A shift led by Africans young, bold, unafraid to rewrite the rules. And the old powers, they were scared, not of weapons but of awakening, because a continent that awakens cannot be controlled. If you're watching this and still wondering, what does this have to do with me? The answer is everything. Because when one part of the world stands up to exploitation, it sets a precedent for all. Because Traore's fight is not just Burkina Faso's. It's the Philippines' fight. It's Palestine's. It's the fight of indigenous communities in Brazil, of forgotten tribes in Papua, of workers in Bangladesh. It is the universal fight for dignity. So don't scroll past this. Don't let this video be another story you watch and forget. Share it, discuss it, defend it, and most importantly, learn from it. Because power does not yield unless it is challenged. And today, one young African president has issued that challenge. Burkina Faso lit the match, but the fire is spreading. The next chapter will be written in Niamey, Conakry, Bamako, and beyond. Who will stand next? Who will resist? Who will lead? The old world is trembling, the new one is knocking, and this time Africa is not asking for permission. It is taking its place. In the dusty classrooms of Bobo Dioulasso and the bustling markets of Kaya, a question had begun to rise quietly at first, then thunderously: what does it mean to be free? It was no longer rhetoric for diplomats or slogans painted on walls. It was a living question whispered in homes, debated in cafes, chanted in marches. Freedom was no longer about flags and anthems. It was about control. Control of land, of narratives, of futures. Traoré's stance had done more than expose a plot. It had unearthed a buried truth for decades. Africa had been negotiating from a place of fear of sanctions, of isolation, of collapse. But Burkina Faso had flipped the script. The message now echoed continent-wide: we are not afraid. In Senegal, a group of students published a manifesto titled The New Independence. In it, they rejected debt traps, military dependency, and foreign-controlled development projects. They called for schools to teach African languages before European ones, for technology parks built with local engineers, and for media funded not by foreign donors, but by African citizens. The manifesto spread like wildfire, not just because of what it said, but because of what it represented: the end of silence. Even rural villages joined in. Elders who once warned the youth to avoid politics now encouraged them to organize to lead. In Togo, an 82-year-old griot recorded a song praising the defiance of Traoré, blending ancient rhythms with modern urgency. In Namibia, a female-led cooperative renamed their farming network ADF Fields in honor of the African Defense Federation. But perhaps the most unexpected support came from the diaspora. Across London, Paris, Toronto, and New York, African immigrants held forums and rallies. These were not the traditional diaspora meetings with quiet dinners and ceremonial speeches. These were passionate intergenerational gatherings where young Africans challenged old ideas, demanded change, and raised funds for grassroots movements back home. One organizer in Berlin said it best: "We may live in Europe, but we dream in Africa." As the movement gained momentum, global reaction grew more desperate. Western media accused Traoré of aligning with authoritarian regimes. Think tanks published risk analyses warning investors to pull out of West Africa. An op-ed in a major U.S. newspaper claimed the ADF was a threat to regional stability. But the people no longer listened to the same voices. They had their own analysts now, professors, journalists, students, elders who spoke not in accents borrowed from foreign schools, but in the truth forged by lived experience. They didn't want new masters, they wanted no masters. In response to the smear campaigns, Traoré's administration launched the Pan-African Media Fund, a continental initiative to empower independent African journalists, fact-checkers, and storytellers. Its mission was simple: protect the truth. Within weeks, dozens of journalists who had been silenced or exiled returned to their craft. A new network, Truth Africa, began broadcasting across the continent, countering lies with fact, propaganda with principle. But the road ahead was not without danger. On a rainy morning in Niamey, a bomb exploded near a newly established ADF coordination office. Though no one claimed responsibility, local sources pointed to operatives linked with external intelligence networks. Traoré, upon hearing the news, didn't issue threats. Instead, he visited the wounded. He spoke softly but firmly. "Our enemies want us to respond with rage. We will respond with unity." And unity indeed became the greatest weapon. In an extraordinary session held in Conakry, 5 heads of state signed the Declaration of Continental Sovereignty, pledging to support one another in the face of external pressures. The declaration was more than ink on paper. It included concrete plans, shared digital infrastructure, continental payment systems, agricultural independence, and the most symbolic of all, a joint university, named the Sankara Institute for Leadership and Liberation. For the first time, young Africans saw a future that wasn't just a dream, but a blueprint. They saw engineers designing solar grids in Niger, not imported from Europe, but built with local resources. They saw youth councils advising parliament in Guinea. They saw African currency talks move from theory to trial runs. They saw something that had long been denied to them: dignity as destiny. And while the old order tried to frame this as rebellion, the truth was clearer than ever: this was resurrection, not of ancient empires, but of self-worth, not of vengeance, but of vision. And above it all, standing quietly but resolutely, was Traoré. He knew he might not see the end of this movement, But he didn't need to, because real leadership isn't about ruling forever, it's about sparking something that outlives you. What began in the quiet resolve of a presidential office had now spilled into boardrooms, classrooms, villages, and even into the digital ether. The war was no longer just geopolitical, it was generational. A battle between those who feared disruption and those who believed in rebirth. The ADF was not merely a military alliance, it had become a moral compass. And as more countries expressed interest in joining, the question shifted from if it could work to how it would endure the inevitable storms ahead. South Africa pledged cyber defense experts. Mali offered airspace coordination and border intelligence. Guinea announced a resource-sharing pact to counter supply chain attacks. And in Niger, a new department, the Ministry of Continental Cooperation, was created to focus solely on African-led partnerships, bypassing traditional Western aid structures. But with every declaration of unity, the attacks intensified. A viral video surfaced in late July, poorly edited, voice altered, showing a man claiming to be Traore, negotiating secretly with Russian mercenaries. Within hours, it was debunked by a coalition of independent African digital forensics teams. But the damage was done. Western media amplified the clip. Headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso's president linked to Wagner Group." Traore responded not with press conferences, but with facts. He released a transparent report listing all foreign contracts signed since his presidency, including those rejected. He called on other African leaders to do the same. It was an act of political judo, turning accusation into accountability. More importantly, it was a message to his people. We will win this war with transparency, not tricks. The youth responded. Universities across the continent launched a new initiative, the People's Syllabus. It combined political history, digital literacy, economic independence, and decolonial philosophy into free open-source courses. The slogan was simple: educate to liberate. Students in Lagos debated resource control in Burkina Faso. High schoolers in Nairobi held forums on Pan-African currency. Podcasts emerged led by 17-year-olds, analyzing military policy with precision previously reserved for diplomats. And for the first time in modern memory, Africa was not following the world's narrative. It was writing its own. While Burkina Faso stood in the eye of the storm, tremors were felt far beyond. In the United Kingdom, MPs questioned why their defense ministry had military advisors in West Africa. In France, students protested outside the Élysée Palace, chanting, "Respect African sovereignty." In the United States, congressional hearings debated the future of AFRICOM and whether its presence now did more harm than good. Old systems were fraying, not because of coups or chaos, but because of clarity, and clarity is contagious. In Brazil, indigenous leaders sent letters of solidarity to Traore, citing the parallels of land theft and media manipulation. In the Philippines, youth groups mirrored ADF's manifesto in their campaign for territorial integrity. Even in Europe, disenfranchised rural communities looked to Africa's movement and asked themselves, have we too surrendered too much for too little? Traore, from his small landlocked nation, had sparked a global mirror, forcing both the global South and North to re-examine the definitions of strength, leadership, and independence, and that more than any military base or mining contract was what truly terrified the old world. Because once people see the mask, they cannot unsee it, and once they name the game, they stop playing by its rules. Late one evening, in a quiet moment inside the presidential library, Traore met with his advisors to draft a new constitutional clause for Burkina Faso. It wasn't about term limits or taxes, it was about dignity. The clause would state, no foreign entity shall control, manage, or advise upon the defense economy or resource extraction of the nation without full parliamentary transparency and public access. It was radical in its simplicity, governance by consent, accountability by design. The room was silent as the words were read aloud. Some wept quietly, not because of sadness, but because of recognition. The past so long weighed down by colonization and corruption was finally being exercised not with vengeance but with vision. The world expected a military uprising. What it got was a constitutional revolution, and revolutions written in law last longer than those written in blood. There's a rhythm rising in Africa, not the kind that reverberates from concert halls or dusty drums, but one that pulses from the hearts of a people reclaiming their voice. It began as whispers in Ouagadougou, but now it hums across Bamako, Kinshasa, Lusaka. It is the sound of self-definition of nations tired of the echo chambers of empire, choosing instead to write in their own frequency. This new rhythm doesn't march to deadlines imposed by foreign media cycles. It does not fear the disapproving tone of diplomats. It is slow, deliberate unbending, a rhythm of dignity, of memory, of awakening. Traore once said in private, "We were told for too long that survival was enough, but now we want more than survival, we want meaning." And meaning, it turns out, is the most dangerous thing to demand from a world built on compliance. The more Burkina Faso leaned into its own voice, the more the global powers attempted to muffle it. Sanctions whispered threats through trade embargoes. NGOs once hailed as neutral began to withdraw under security concerns. Suddenly, aid vanished from clinics. Software stopped working in public offices due to expired licenses owned by foreign corporations. It was punishment, the kind not declared but inflicted quietly. But Burkina Faso did not panic. Instead, engineers began rewriting code. Doctors improvised with local remedies. Communities revived ancestral techniques for farming and healing. Necessity once again became the mother of innovation. And Africa, once labeled dependent, became determined. In classrooms once starved of books, something radical began to take root. Not just new curriculums, but new confidence. Teachers no longer confined by colonial syllabi taught not only world history, but African futurism. Students were invited to imagine not what the West wanted from Africa, but what Africa wanted for itself. Young people no longer aspired only to leave the continent for a better life. They began to stay, to build, to question, to challenge. A 14-year-old girl in Ghana launched a podcast titled "We Are Not Poor," featuring interviews with farmers, artists, and inventors across the continent. Within weeks, it hit 1 million downloads, not because it was promoted by an algorithm, but because it spoke a forgotten truth. Poverty, as they came to realize, was often not about lack, but about theft, of value, of vision, of voice. And reclaiming that voice began with knowing the stories that had been buried, the revolutions that were crushed before they could be named, the leaders who were assassinated before they could inspire. Traore's rise rekindled old names, Sankara and Nkrumah Lumumba, but this time they were not mourned. They were resurrected not as martyrs, but as mentors. A generation finally saw that leadership was not a title, but a service, not a privilege, but a responsibility. And slowly, from Lusaka to Kigali, blackboards bore a new phrase: Africa is enough. Yet in the boardrooms of power, not all was chaos. Some listened. Not every Western leader believed Africa was simply acting irrationally. A few quietly, discreetly began asking the right questions. Why now? Why Traore? Why are youth no longer listening to our embassies? One Nordic ambassador reportedly told their staff, "We need to rethink aid not as charity, but as reparations, not as leverage, but as partnership." But such ideas remained whispered in corridors, too radical for podiums, too honest for headlines. The institutions that once designed Africa's dependency now scrambled to rebrand themselves. They used new words: equity, inclusivity, African-led initiatives, yet their budgets, boards, and behaviors remained unchanged. But Africa had grown wiser. They now understood that the most dangerous form of control wasn't domination but simulation. The illusion of freedom wrapped in grants and goodwill. So Traore stopped attending the summits designed to flatter and disarm. Instead, he held listening tours in villages, hosted Pan-African youth assemblies, sat with farmers and poets, asking them not for applause, but for answers. He understood what the old world had forgotten. True intelligence does not reside in data alone, but in lived experience. What frightened the old powers was not that Burkina Faso had rejected a military base. It was that they had rejected the mental occupation. For decades, nations had complied, not because they lacked the means to resist, but because they lacked the belief that resistance was even possible. Traore shattered that illusion. He showed that standing up may be costly, but staying down was soul-deep suicide. And that belief spread like pollen on wind unseen, but everywhere. Villages began holding local referenda on foreign-owned land. Cities formed cooperatives to regain control over utilities. Elders spoke in town halls about pre-colonial governance systems that once worked not as nostalgia, but as blueprints. And children, the greatest mirror of any society, stopped playing games where heroes wore foreign flags. Instead, they drew themselves as pilots, presidents, poets. It was not pride, it was presence. But no rebirth is free. Burkina Faso still faced challenges, real and ruthless. Cyber attacks disabled financial systems. Food prices soared. A failed harvest brought rural strain. And political instability loomed as infiltrators tried to corrupt from within. And yet what stood firm was the why. Because when a nation remembers why it stands, even its stumbles have direction. Traore never claimed to have all the answers, but he refused to repeat old mistakes. His cabinet included more women than ever before. Budgets were debated in public forums. Foreign guests were required to disclose affiliations. And when a loyal minister was caught hoarding grain, meant for relief, he was dismissed not silently, but on live TV, with Traore stating, "Revolution means we hold even our friends accountable." It was messy, it was painful, it was necessary, and above all, it was theirs. As Burkina Faso carved its path, others followed, not out of obligation, but inspiration. Mozambique launched a national dialogue on mineral sovereignty. Uganda announced a moratorium on new military agreements. Tanzania passed a transparency bill mandating all foreign contracts be made public. And across the Atlantic in the Caribbean, leaders invoked Traore's name in calls for regional unity. The world map was not changing lines, but it was changing loyalties. The age of imposed alliances was fading. A new age of chosen kinship, of deliberate alignment was being born. And Africa, long treated as the last frontier, was becoming the first voice. In the quiet between battles, something deeper is taking root, not rebellion, but rebirth. Burkina Faso has shown the world that true sovereignty begins not with borders, but with belief. A belief that dignity cannot be negotiated, that silence is no longer safety, and that history belongs to those who dare to rewrite it. As the world watches, one truth becomes undeniable. Africa is no longer waiting for change. It is becoming the change. And in that becoming, steady, proud, unyielding lies the future not only of a continent, but of a more honest world.